years since Illinois passed a significant bail reform act, and now there's quite a bit of discussion in Illinois and elsewhere about doing away with cash bail altogether. What does that look like for justice? And what does that look like for society? Here to tell us more is the CEO of the Bail Project, Robin Steinberg.
I don't actually know what I was expecting when I was a young lawyer, but it definitely involved marble columns, beautiful courtrooms, brilliant legal arguments delivered by caring advocates, and justice, of course, being dispensed by judges with Solomon-like wisdom, compassion, and righteousness. But then I stepped into my first criminal courthouse in New York City. It was the 1980s, and we were in the middle of the Get Tough on Crime years. The war on drugs was in full swing, police departments were expanding and militarizing, and mandatory minimum sentences were all the rage. The media referred to young men of color as super predators, and women who just needed social service support as welfare queens. It seemed as if America couldn't lock people up fast enough. We were well on our way to mass incarceration. And as I approached that courthouse that first time, I saw a Department of Corrections bus pull up next to the building and unload men and women chained together. They were led into a small door on the side of the building where they disappeared. Inside, the courthouse was no better. The hallways were lined with people, families, and children, most of them Black and Latinx, waiting anxiously for the courtroom doors to open. And once they did, there was a frenetic, desperate energy that filled the air as family members poured in and took their seats. As court officers called out names, the accused were led into the courtroom in handcuffs. Family members would strain to see their loved ones. They'd sneak a little wave, they'd share a smile, and there were tears. So many tears. Each court proceeding lasted barely a minute. Charges were read out loud, and it was for conduct that I knew was happening everywhere in New York City, but I also knew was only being policed in low-income communities of color. The accused stood silently as cursory arguments were made by disinterested advocates. And I quickly understood, as that young lawyer, that this was the embodiment of what had come to pass for justice in America. It turns out that my dreams about marble and morality and justice, well, they were a little bit like expecting a serious romance in the middle of a horror movie. And I suppose after that first day, I could have walked away vowing to never be part of a system that seemed to be so dehumanizing and so cruel. But I just couldn't do it. Instead, it convinced me that that was exactly where I wanted to be. And so I became a public defender, and I threw myself headlong into the system. And standing by someone as the terrifying power of the criminal legal system and the power to take away life and freedom bore down on my clients was a privilege. Demanding that my clients not be defined by a charge or even their own worst moment. Honoring their dignity, fighting for their humanity, no matter what the accusation, that was a transformational honor. And yes, of course, it was also heartbreaking and enraging and frustrating. And for years late at night, I would lay awake in my bed trying to come to terms with what I had seen. A legal system that tore families apart, inflicted punishment with seemingly no mercy, and administered justice on the size of a person's bank account and all too often the color of their skin. It was a system that was gutting our most fundamental legal principle, that all people are entitled to equal justice under the law. And nowhere was that more apparent to me than when cash bail was set. Watching my clients being hauled off into a jail cell before they'd been convicted of anything, solely because they did not have enough money to pay for the price of their freedom, made my blood boil. And when I fought back, judges would often chastise me. "Counselor, calm down. It's only a few days in jail before the next court date." But jail is so profoundly a dehumanizing, violent, and terrifying existence that a few days can make all the difference. You can lose your job, your home, your children, your immigration status. You're exposed to a high risk of physical and sexual violence. About a third of sexual victimization involving jail staff happens in those first 24 hours. And 40% of jail deaths, including suicides and homicides, occur within the first week. And if you're a mom who's the sole provider, the impact on your children can be catastrophic. Children with incarcerated mothers are 5 times more likely to have their kids wind up in foster care than with incarcerated fathers. Facing all of this and all of these consequences, anyone would plead guilty whether they did it or not. Our cash bail system, resulting in wealth-based detention, has created nothing short of a human rights crisis in this country. Let me paint you a quick picture of what that actually looks like. Pretrial detention, fueled by unaffordable cash bail, accounts for nearly 100% of jail growth in America for the past 20 years. About 2.5 million people are held in jail each year because they can't pay bail, and tonight, 500,000 people will go to sleep in a jail cell because they can't pay bail. People of color are disproportionately impacted, accounting for 50% of pretrial population nationwide, and in some jurisdictions, that number is as high as 90%. And women are the fastest growing incarcerated population in America, and they are disproportionately held in jail on bail. Look, the human cost of pretrial detention is shocking, but the economic cost is also staggering. It costs taxpayers $14 billion annually to hold people in jail pretrial. And if you calculate in the collateral costs, it is estimated to be as high as $140 billion every year. Wealth-based detention has made America one of the most incarcerated nations on the planet. And like every other single aspect of our criminal legal system, from policing to prosecutorial charging decisions, bail, sentencing, prison discipline, reentry, probation, and parole, racial disparities are everywhere. And if cash bail is set and you are black or brown, you are 2 times more likely to remain in a jail cell than your white counterpart. In turn, you're more likely to plead guilty, get a jail sentence, and a conviction that will create obstacles and barriers for you for the rest of your life. And unlike most decisions in the criminal legal system that turn on law and facts and the interpretation of evidence, the horrors of pretrial incarceration are the direct and singular result of exactly one thing: money. The injustice of being jailed pretrial can be prevented simply by passing a few $100 bills through a bail window. As one of our supporters so astutely pointed out, so, money can't solve all your problems, but when it comes to cash bail, it kind of can. So after more than 3 decades of being a public defender, I decided to throw myself into the fight to transform our bail system. In 2007, we developed a model in the Bronx to disrupt cash bail and the fundamental power dynamics of the pretrial system. It was a simple, elegant idea. We created a not-for-profit revolving bail fund that used philanthropic dollars to pay bail for our clients at the Bronx Defenders, the public defender office that I was running at the time. And here's how it worked. We paid bail, provided court reminders, transportation, and voluntary referrals to social services. And because bail comes back at the end of a criminal case, the money would be returned to the fund where we could use it to pay bail for others in the community. But what were the results when bail was paid by the Bronx Freedom Fund? Well, a decade of data shows that over 95% of our clients returned to court, and once bail was paid, over half of the cases were dismissed, and fewer than 2% of clients even got a jail sentence. Not only did the results lay waste to the myth that it was money that made people come back to court, it exposed the advantages that freedom brings not only to people's lives, but on their case outcomes. And so with the Bronx Freedom Fund as our proof of concept, we launched the Bail Project last year, with the goal of taking this decarceration strategy to high-need jurisdictions across America. We have a 2-pronged strategy. First, we provide immediate relief to those stuck in jail because they don't have enough money. Once out, we provide effective court reminders, voluntary referrals to social services, and pretrial support like transportation assistance or daycare. We call our model community release with support. Next, we're collecting a national data set and telling the stories of the human impacts of pretrial detention to better inform policymakers, local elected officials, judges, and advocates. The goal is to ensure that there is long-term systemic change. In just over a year since launching, we have been able to assist nearly 5,000 people, and we've opened 9 new sites in diverse locations across the country, from Tulsa to Detroit and Compton, California to Louisville, Kentucky. Our goal is to create a nationally representative portfolio of 25 sites to provide critical insights to jurisdictions with similar traits, things like size of pretrial population, racial demographics, or even political leanings. And the work at each site is led by a full-time staff called bail disruptors who come from the communities that they serve. Many have personal lived experience in the legal system that informs and inspires their work, bailing community members out, supporting them throughout the process, and advancing systemic change in their communities and cities. Just this month, we opened a new site in Baton Rouge, and you may be excited to hear that we are launching here in Chicago too. In the next few weeks, we'll be opening our site here where we will join the efforts of other grassroots organizations doing similar work like the Coalition to End Money Bail and the Chicago Community Bond Fund in bringing people home and pushing for long-term systemic change. Do not misunderstand what I'm saying. Bail funds are not the answer to systemic injustice. But this intervention is a crucial tool to provide an immediate lifeline to those locked in jail cells right now as we continue to debate and fight for systemic change that will make bailouts no longer necessary. Our long-term goal at the Bail Project is to put ourselves out of business, one jurisdiction at a time. Our two-tier system of justice, one for the rich and one for everybody else, has to end. But it is not going to be easy. Systems do not go down without a fight. So if we are not vigilant and thoughtful and analytic, we will run the risk of recreating systems that embed the same racial and economic inequalities we all seek to end. Electronic monitoring, risk algorithms, probation-like supervision or surveillance can also lead to unequal treatment, racial disparities, injustice, and incarceration. But it is possible to reimagine a better pretrial justice system. So what stops us? Why are conversations about bail reform so complicated, so divisive, and without obvious solutions? Well, perhaps the answers are elusive because we often wind up focusing on the wrong thing. Rather than engage in productive civil discourse and dive into the facts and have rational conversations, our minds drift to the rare, the hypothetical, the unforgivable, and the scary. Maybe that's human nature. Maybe it's the result of a sensationalized news cycle that runs on a deeply racialized narrative of fear that has been used to justify the worst excesses of our criminal system. Or maybe it's just deeply entrenched economic interests that seek to maintain the criminal legal system at its current size. Or maybe we all just watch too much Law and Order on television. But whatever it is, it takes us down a particular path. Rather than look at what usually happens or what most people do, we wind up creating a system designed to protect us against the scary thing that rarely happens. In other words, we wind up legislating around the exception. We don't do that in any other area of our lives. We take risks daily, calculated risks. We drive cars even though we know that fatal accidents happen, but they don't happen often, so we get up and we drive to work every morning. In the context of our criminal legal system, focusing on the exception, on the rare and scary things, leads us to justify the inexcusable. Torture, solitary confinement, the death penalty, to name just a few. So let's not do that. Let's talk about what we know, not the things we fear. We know that holding someone in jail pretrial makes them 30% more likely to commit a crime when they get out than if they had been free all along. And we know about the devastating consequences of jail, not just for the accused, but for her family and for her community. But we know a lot more, because in those few places where significant bail reform has taken hold, New Jersey and New York to name a few, not only have thousands and thousands of people gotten out of jail, they have done so without any aggregate impact on public safety. New York City recently released new data from a study that analyzed more than 5 million cases between 1987 and 2018, a period when pretrial release in New York without any money bail increased from 50% to 76%, making New York City one of the least incarcerated major cities in America. And the results were impressive. New York City's return to court rate was 86%, and crime rates continue to plummet with decarceration, making New York City one of the safest cities in America. No doubt, those numbers embolden the recent passage of, finally, statewide bail reform in New York that essentially eliminates cash bail for almost every misdemeanor and most felonies. And across the river, New Jersey overhauled its pretrial justice system 2 years ago to include a presumption of release for most people and a prohibition of the use of cash bail except in the rarest of circumstances. And in the first year, New Jersey reduced its prison population by 20%. What does the data tell us about crime rates during that period? Since the passage of that sweeping statewide bail reform, violent crime rates have fallen by almost 30%. And here in Chicago, where reform efforts by a wide array of stakeholders, from judges to the DA, to the public defender, to the sheriff, to grassroots organizations, have led to a significant decrease in the jail population, and violent crimes reported have declined by 8%. Have there been isolated incidents around the country of people being released and then while out committing a terrible crime? Yes, of course. And those instances are heartbreaking, and they can lead us to question ourselves. And they certainly do justify some reflection. But when the emotional reaction passes and the dark clouds of fear and doubt disappear, rational thought returns and grounds us in what usually happens, not what rarely happens, and reminds us of the everyday myriad injustices that are the norms, not the outliers. By holding true to our justice values, maintaining civil discourse, and making evidence-based arguments, even when it's hard to do, we can avoid being drawn into the emotional cyclone of the exception that impedes progress and will halt systemic reform in its tracks. Look, there is enormous momentum for change in our criminal legal system right now, and support for pretrial bail reform is growing. It is possible to reimagine a system that is actually about justice. And it is possible to realize those young dreams that I had on that very first day I walked into that very first New York City courtroom. With the winds of change at our backs and a diverse set of impactful strategies and a real, genuine commitment to reckoning with our past and what we have done with our criminal legal system to communities of color and low-income communities across the country, I believe now, more than ever, that when it comes to real systemic bail reform, the future is indeed right now. Thank you.